Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ruminate This with Agrarian Solutions. Join us as we explore ruminant nutrition and the impact of mycotoxins. Here, we challenge your curiosity and explore new industry insights and research to optimize your herd's health and performance. Hey, welcome back to Ruminate This with Agrarian Solutions. I'm your host, Scott Zierke. And I know I say this every time, Dr. Roth, but I'm excited to have you as part of this conversation today. We're going to be talking about the impact of diseases on U.S. dairy farms and abroad. And an interesting article that you and I have looked over, I think I first saw it maybe Dairy Herd Management or somewhere where it was reposted. And I know you sent me an article from the Bovine Veterinarian. But what just kind of brought to light for us is re-looking, I guess, a little bit at some of the diseases that impact dairy globally and domestically. And so just to kind of give a little bit of an overview, there's a group that Dr. Philip Rasmussen, he's out of the University of Copenhagen, Denmark, and he put together a study that they're hoping to have soon published in the Journal of Dairy Science. And basically they ranked, this was a global ranking of the top 12 diseases in terms of annual loss, and you reported in US dollars, and did that ranking globally. And Larry, I have to admit, when I first read that, I said, wow, I'm curious how that tracks with the US. And we did discover some differences. So globally, they've discovered subclinical ketosis was the number one thing with an $18 billion economic impact in annual losses for dairies, followed by subclinical mastitis and clinical mastitis, I should say. They have them separate, but clinical mastitis was 13 billion, subclinical 9 billion. This is annually globally. Lameness, number 4 on the list, is 6 billion. You get into metritis, 5 billion. Number 6, ovarian cysts at 4 billion. Number 7, you have yonis and paratuberculosis at 4 billion. Retained placenta, 3 billion. DAs, we're going to call it 600 million. Dystocia, 600 million. Milk fever, hypocalcemia, number 11 at 600 million. And lastly on the list, clinical ketosis at about 200 million annually. So Larry, you dove into a little bit of this and just wanted to get your take on that list globally. I know you had done some digging as to what countries maybe were most affected by, say, subclinical ketosis. And know if you wanted to chime in on that.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's just very interesting, Scott. I mean, it looks at your top 12 diseases across the world. And this article appeared in the Journal of Dairy Science in August. So it's out there for people to view in September. And they put a lot of work into this and combined a lot of numbers, and boy, there's so much to dig into and understand with it. But a lot of it comes back to meeting that cow's nutrient needs that very first day. For example, they had New Zealand and Australia by themselves as Oceania, and they had the biggest losses for subclinical ketosis. So we think of those cows as freshening on to grass, and they're just not able to meet their energy needs. Now, exactly how they measured subclinical, I don't know. What level of bleeding did they do of cows and so forth? So, there's all of that to take into account. But you look at it, things like milk fever, things that we just don't think about anymore in this country. In other countries where they don't have dry periods or they just let the cow walk down the road, some of these problems come back up.
Yeah.
There's so many interesting things in this study. Looking at the value of milk, the highest value per milk was actually in Africa, but yet the people aren't able to buy the product. And there's different nutritional challenges that come up in different areas. So just a very interesting article.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that kind of prompted me to want to discuss this with you on a podcast. So the countries that have the biggest overall annual losses. So India checked in at number 1 with 12 billion, which, I mean, there's a lot of cows in India. don't necessarily make a whole lot of milk per cow. However, the US checked in at 8 billion annual, China at 5 billion. Let's dive into that 8 billion domestically for us here in the US. I was digging up some articles online and they were all pretty consistent in the sense that if you ranked the diseases by economic impact or loss to the industry, good old mastitis comes up number one in the US. And, that's looking at clinical and subclinical together, followed by lameness and then reproductive disorders such as metritis and retained placenta. And then you get down to number 4 on the list, the metabolic diseases, the ketosis, milk fever, DAs. So a little bit different shakedown here in the US, but I'd like to jump up to that number 1 on the list, the mastitis part, right? I mean, there's a lot that can go into a cow getting mastitis, right? Bacterial, viral, and then the economic impact. Obviously, you have treatment costs, milk discarding, loss of production, for the rest of that lactation a lot of times. Just your thoughts on that ranking, mastitis, lameness, and reproductive disorders here in the US, and I'll let you kind of elaborate there.
Okay. Let's do this. Let's look at those in relation to the comment I made earlier that a lot of these disorders can trace back their origin to challenges the day of calving. So the first one was mastitis. And mastitis, to me, is saying that the teat is unable to defend itself against invading agents. Well, why would that be? Certainly, it could be due to sanitation. What's the level of pathogens in the environment? But we also know that cows who have milk fever, or more importantly, subclinical milk fever, later on have higher incidence of mastitis, showing that there's a relationship between subclinical milk fever or a calcium shortage and immune function. So right there, we're not able to meet the cow's calcium needs. And if she is short on dry matter intake, even once we get several days out, she's not meeting her calcium needs, and then she's going to be more likely to have mastitis. So that's where that comes into play. The one that's kind of interesting is lameness, and we can trace lameness back to so many different things. It isn't just acidosis or foundering; it's the environment, it's cement, so many different things. But again, I think there's a digestive origin there. If we're feeding too high of an energy diet, again, just not meeting her needs, she may be more prone to some laminitis. And, there's so many things that come into play with hoof trimming and so forth there.
Oh, hoof trimming, genetics, structure of the leg, heel angle, everything, there's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned the flooring, right? Concrete, is it grooved well and they're slipping? What are the beds like? There's a lot to unpack in that conversation. And I think we see a lot of different farms across the country, and there's a lot of work being done on dairies to manage things like the cleanliness of the freshening pen, the stalls, the deep bedded sand, right? I appreciate you bringing in the nutrition component to it, because it's never just one thing. If I've learned anything in the 10, 11 years I've worked in the professional space in the dairy industry, I've never discovered one thing is the single smoking gun in any of these herds that I've ever been on. Diving into number 3, we got the reproductive disorders, metritis, RPs. Talk to us from a nutritional perspective.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it comes back to me, as simple as the Brett hypothesis. If the cow is slow in taking off from lactation, she's got immune challenges going on. We have glucose taken away to keep her alive, keep her functioning, keep her trying to make lactose. And the last need to be met is going to be reproduction.
Yeah.
The metritis, be it subclinical or clinical, again, to me, the immune system isn't able to defend the reproductive tract. We can talk about retained placentas, correlations between that and immune function. Another one's the ovarian cyst. There's a mycotoxin element to ovarian cysts, but there's also an element of, I don't want to say poor nutrition, but undernutrition, because the cow is being fed right, but is she consuming enough? And we go back again to challenges day one. We go back to rumen challenges, and she may be consuming enough, but the nutrients are going to other things. One of the most interesting items in this article is figure 2, which appears on page 6950. But they've got the good old circle graph, and they got all of these different metabolic disorders. And then they got lines going between the disorders, and they vary by thickness and by color, indicating the level of relationship between the two. Kind of interesting. If you look at yonis, when was the last time we really talked about yonis? The biggest thing that it is related to is laminitis.
Mm.
We bring in things like milk fever, very strong relation that comes over to calving difficulties, subclinical ketosis, very strong relation to milk fever, subclinical milk fever. So again, anything that slows the cow off in increasing in her feed intake is going to lead to a host of challenges. And then we look at how interrelated they are. And the interesting thing about Rasmussen et al. Was they tried to take into account the comorbidities using different studies and doing statistics and so forth for that. So I think need to make that kind of comment that they are trying to take comorbidities into play. But again, sometimes we overthink things, Scott. Is the cow comfortable? Is she consuming feed, second lactation and greater? Are we meeting her calcium needs? Is the rumen functioning right? You do those things right there. Easy for me to say, you do those things right. She's going to take off in feed intake. She's going to take off in milk production. She's going to get bred on a timely basis and stay pregnant, and life is good. So to me, this study brings us back to the importance of the dry period and those first 3 weeks of lactation, and especially day one.
It never fails if you're looking to figure out transition issues, if you're looking to figure out reproductive, I'm going to say lack of reproductive efficiency at service 1, it's the dry period.
Mm-hmm.
It all starts before you see the outcomes. So speaking of where things begin, I'm looking at number 5 on the top list of things impacting U.S. dairymen. Bovine respiratory disease. So typically we're going to see that in calves, right? But it can affect adult cows, obviously. But on the calf side in particular, you have a saying, day 1, week 1, month 1. And that's really where BRD is going to have the biggest impact, not just on that animal, but for the rest of her life, right? So we're looking at decreased growth rates, lower milk yield, and obviously in bad cases, these cattle die or are euthanized. So talk to us a little about BRD and again, where we can speak to that nutritionally.
You bet. So again, whatever happens to that calf from the moment it enters the world. And yeah, we get a little bit of respiratory, and do we let that fire linger? It might be just a smoldering fire, or do we go in and we put it out with a big fire extinguisher? Because the basic thing is this: if we reduce the animal's lung capacity as a calf, becomes a mature cow, uses its lungs for cooling. So she freshens on that hot July day. She's dependent upon her impaired lungs, and maybe they're just reduced in capacity by 5%. We've reduced her ability, number 1, to cool herself, number 2, to bring in oxygen for metabolism. And I think sometimes we forget about just the importance of having oxygen to do metabolism. And what's interesting is in this top 12 list, respiratory does not appear at any place. But respiratory is related to probably each one of the disorders that are listed. Because again, we got to have oxygen for basic physiological processes. And again, if the animal is hot and cools herself with her lungs, and we reduce that ability to cool herself, she's going to be more prone to have some of these disorders. So again, Scott, I think one of the things that I find so interesting, the figure that showed the interrelationship between the disorders, and then to think about the relationships to items that didn't make the list. So it was all quite interesting.
Well, it's all connected, right? You and I were on a dairy a couple of years ago that were seeing some lung lesions in calves, and they were scoring, and we were looking at it. And your comment that day to the dairyman and to myself was, if we take care of the gut health, the lung health will get better. It's all connected.
Absolutely.
Speaking of mycotoxins, if you're listening to this episode, the Monday that this episode airs, we are going to be discussing our mycotoxin report. So we're going to be looking at some 2024 corn silage samples here in a couple of weeks, anything that's been coming in through the lab, and hopefully you guys can tune in for that one. And Larry, just quickly, what would be some of the advantages to understanding what the toxin levels are going into the bunk?
Scott, we've got 1,000 tons of corn silage, 100,000 tons of corn silage, whatever. That's inventory, and we need to know if that's a clean inventory, if it's got a lot of starch to it, a lot of energy. That determines a lot about what our feeding program is going to be for the next year from a nutrition standpoint. It also determines, do we have a clean inventory, or do we need to be prepared for some challenges? So if we're sampling our corn forage going into storage, we're already ahead of the game for when we get into feeding it. Why wait 3 months, 4 months until we start feeding that corn silage and then say, oh my God, we got all kinds of mycotoxins. What are we going to do? If we know what we have in terms of feed hygiene and nutrition going into the pile, into storage, we know what we're going to have coming out. And coming out, it's only going to be worse than what it was going in. So we need to know a starting point so we can put our game plan together.
You made a great point, and I'll just piggyback off what you said by one of the things that I like about sampling the corn as it's going in. And I know for most of the country at this point, the harvest is over. So think about next year is then when we do sample after the fact, we can see what changes happened. And we can tell a lot about how well the stuff was ensiled by what toxins may have grown during storage. So with that, if anybody would like to take advantage of our sampling program, email us podcast@agrsol.com. And so what did we do, Larry? We actually did a better job with the gut health, and the lung scores seem to improve. So, just going back to the top of the list, mastitis, ketosis, those things, we talk about at Agrarian that we exist to help others succeed. What's our place in this conversation?
Right.
Where do we fit?
Yeah. We've kind of made our reputation on the ability to help defend and protect against mycotoxins. What do mycotoxins do? They impair physiology of the animal. So the animal now is having to divert nutrients from productive purposes and, shall we say, defensive purposes to trying to resolve this mycotoxin related inflammation. Well, she's got other challenges going on. She may be attacked by respiratory organisms, digestive pathogens, but she's not able to defend herself against those. And so then we start to see these other disorders show up. If the cow has an impaired liver due to mycotoxin related inflammation, she's going to be more prone to ketosis, be it clinical or subclinical. The liver is the body's biochemical factory. And if our factory is in disrepair, everything related to her physiology is going to suffer. So I look at mycotoxins as being the foundation to helping the cow defend and protect herself against all of these other issues. I mean, no place on this list, Scott, is there mycotoxicosis, all right?
Yeah.
But we can make the case that mycotoxins are related to each one of these items. If the cow is under mycotoxin attack, her use of calcium is going to be altered. If the cow is under mycotoxin attack, she doesn't have as much energy, or more specifically glucose, to make milk, fuel the immune system, do other physiological processes. She's more likely to fall into clinical or subclinical ketosis. Take the mastitis and the metritis. She's dealing with mycotoxin attack. We don't have the nutrients to support the immune system for helping to resolve some of these reproductive related challenges. So let's think about building a strong foundation in the cow, resolve the mycotoxin situation, help her be prepared for her most challenging day of the year, and then recover from that. And then I think these major metabolic disorders start to go down.
Larry, when you think about things, there's a cause and effect to everything that happens within a dairy cow, within a beef cow, but focusing more on the dairy side like we are today, it kind of makes me question what, if you would, the tolerance level of mycotoxins on an individual cow basis, right? So a lot of times we think of, well, we test the TMR and it's less than 1 ppm of DON and it's less than 100 parts per billion of zearalenone. That's probably not causing any issues. But if we're still dealing with cows that are having issues such as increased somatic cell or clinical mastitis, some milk fever, some ketosis, subclinical, if you would, I just wonder if 70% of the cows aren't really affected by those levels, but 30% are. What's that hidden cost there to that dairyman?
Right. I love how you said that, a tolerance basis. And so what instantly went to my mind was tolerance basis reflected the mentality of the dairy producer and the nutritionist. How willing are they to tolerate the mycotoxins or tolerate the damage that's occurring to the cow? You came back and you talked about resistance. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I'm going to define as resistance. So,
Right.
number one,
Right.
we have to think from the human perspective, what level of mycotoxins and their damage are we willing to tolerate before we do something to help defend and protect the cow? Very noted nutritionist, talk to 3 parts per million of DON. We know that's having an impact on the cow. The cows are doing all right. Scott, we've got our research study. There's other research studies that show at that level of DON, you're losing milk, but are we willing to tolerate that? Then let's bring that back to the cow's resistance. Okay. So maybe I'm saying tomato. You came back to the cow's ability, I'm going to say, to resist the mycotoxins. If she's dealing with some of these disorders and her immune system is trying to resolve this inflammation, she's going to be more susceptible to these diseases, or these diseases have lowered her ability to resist. So it all comes into play. The more challenges that she has to deal with, be it overcrowding, be it subclinical ketosis. She didn't take off like she ought to because the post-fresh pen was overcrowded. Her ability to resist mycotoxin attack has been reduced. So all of this comes into play.
Yeah.
And I think the question becomes, how willing are we as the producer or the nutritionist How willing are we to tolerate that risk that the cow is going through? How willing are we to let her be at risk? Because if she's at risk, her ability to resist has been lowered. Her ability to resist these different diseases has been reduced as well. And again, I keep coming back to how interrelated all of these challenges are.
I'm thinking of the bottom 20 to 25% of the herd that has been affected by BVD as a calf or scours.
Yep.
I'm thinking of the bottom 20, 25% of the herd that has had some case of mastitis. And I've seen a lot of dairy comp records in my day. I mean, 20% of the herd be affected by mastitis is not a high number by any means. I'm thinking of the 5 to 8% of the cows that have been affected by clinical ketosis or clinical milk fever. And some studies show up to 50% of the herd that's affected by subclinical milk fever. Boy, we just talked about a lot of cows.
Mhm.
You know, if you're one of these guys that have 20 to 25% of your animals that have had some sort of challenge along the way, I could see where assisting them with DTX, helping them fight that mycotoxin
Mhm.
challenge, you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck there. So maybe in a lower toxin environment, let's say maybe the TMR is only running, Larry, 500 parts per billion of DON, which we would consider relatively low levels.
Mhm.
Maybe on the very best cows that have never had an issue, they're going to sail right along through there. But is there an opportunity there to feed some of these animals or even feed the herd and start cutting into the number of subsequent metabolic disorders,
You bet.
subsequent DAs,
Mhm.
mastitis cases,
Mhm.
because we're helping that animal?
You bet. The more on the edge of the knife that the cow is, the more susceptible she's going to be to the reduced mycotoxin levels. Man, you know what? Everything's great at this dairy. They've got excellent management. Cows are fed consistently, excellent rations. Cows aren't overcrowded. All of the things are done right. They can probably tolerate a higher level of mycotoxins. But
Yeah.
cows that are overcrowded, they're not fed on a consistent basis, they're going to be more susceptible to challenges at a lower level of mycotoxins. They're going to, you're probably going to see a higher incidence of these diseases. Or if these diseases are going on, they made the cow more susceptible to reduced mycotoxin levels. So that's where Scott, you mentioned 500 parts per billion, 0.5 parts per million, same thing. We would tend to call that at a medium risk.
Yep.
And so if a cow was having to deal with all of these other issues, she may be spun out of control by 0.5 part per million DON. Whereas the other cow, where everything is done right, there's no overcrowding, there's minimal challenges put on this cow, she can tolerate a much higher level of mycotoxin, and you're probably going to see fewer of these different diseases. So again, I just come back to how interrelated all of this is. That's why when people ask about, well, what level of mycotoxin do I need to be concerned about? Well, I don't know, because what all else is going on with the cow? How many other challenges is she dealing with? The more challenges she's got to deal with, the lower her threshold is for mycotoxins.
Well, I think you wrapped that up really well, Larry. I appreciate you taking time out of your day today to visit with us about some of these disease challenges we have on U.S. dairies and abroad, and where agrarians' place is within that conversation. So again, we do really believe we exist to help others succeed. So if you'd like to reach out with any questions, we're here for you. Again, that's podcast@agrsol.com. Email me and we'll help you out. So we thank everybody for tuning in. If you like the show, subscribe and share it with your friends, and we will talk to everybody next week. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Scott.
If you found value in today's podcast, please hit subscribe and share. And we look forward to talking to you again next week.